This episode of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is brought to you by Unbound Worlds, a new website for fantasy and science fiction readers. Find exclusive interviews, articles, book excerpts, and more over at unboundworlds.com.
Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 226 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Jonathan Lethem. He's the author of 10 novels, including Dissident Gardens, The Fortress of Solitude, and Motherless Brooklyn, as well as several short story collections and essay collections, including Men in Cartoons and The Ecstasy of Influence. He's a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, and his work has appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's, Rolling Stone, Esquire, and The New York Times. And we'll be speaking with him today about his new book, A Gambler's Anatomy. And today's show is brought to you by Unbound Worlds, a new website focused on the best of the literary, fantasy, and science fiction universe. Unbound Worlds covers fantasy, science fiction, horror, slipstream, pop science, fairy tales, folklore, magical realism, urban fantasy, and anything else that's just a little bit weird. The site features interviews with many of the authors who've appeared on this show, including Terry Brooks, Naomi Novik, R.A. Salvatore, Scott Lynch, Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, Tad Williams, Stephen Erickson, Chuck Palahniuk, Lev Grossman, and Andy Weir, as well as exclusive essays, extended book excerpts, event coverage, and giveaways. And speaking of giveaways, Unbound Worlds is currently celebrating their launch with an epic book giveaway. One lucky reader will be selected to win a carefully curated fantasy and science fiction library consisting of 23 different titles, including The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, Fire Touched by Patricia Briggs, the new Star Wars novel Catalyst Rogue One by James Luceno, Shadowed Souls by Jim Butcher and Carrie L. Hughes, and last but not least, the awesome new Game of Thrones Illustrated Edition by George R. R. Martin, featuring gorgeous full-page artwork, as well as black and white illustrations in every single chapter. To enter the giveaway, just go to unboundworlds.com/sweeps. So that's unboundworlds.com/sweeps. And now let's get to our interview. All right, so we're here with Jonathan Lethem. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so I know that a lot of your early work appeared in science fiction magazines. So just tell us a bit about that period of your life and how you got started writing for those magazines.
Yeah, well, I was living in Berkeley, working in bookstores, reading a lot of science fiction and a lot of other things. And my favorite writers at that time were all associated with genres. I was reading Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard and lots of other, mostly kind of new wave and post-new wave science fiction writers. I was excited about the early glimmerings of cyberpunk. And I was reading a lot of hard-boiled detective fiction, mostly older crime fiction, beginning with my teenage obsession with Raymond Chandler and then my discovery of Patricia Highsmith and Charles Willeford, some of the people that were being republished as the Black Lizard books at that time. And I also was really into what I thought of as a sort of international fabulators, Calvino, Stanislaw Lem. My interest in this was rooted in my identification with Kafka, who I really loved at that time, and Borges. And for me, I thought the natural home for what I want to do is somewhere in this area. This is the kind of writing I want to do. And I was working in in some ways in a vacuum. I dropped out of college. I didn't have any whisper of a hope to go to an MFA program, which is what a lot of the writers in my age cohort were going to end up doing after college. I was reading avidly, kind of self-educating, and I thought, well, I probably am a science fiction writer. I mean, that makes sense. Or I'm a genre writer. And anyway, this is for me where the action, where the energy is right now. So, along with sending stories to the New Yorker and Harper's and Granta, which I was doing, I was sending them, and I'm talking about like blind submissions, just sealing them in an envelope and putting a self-addressed stamped envelope inside that, and writing it down in a card catalog. This was all done in the kind of, pre-internet vacuum. I was just obeying the dictates of how you become a writer. Well, you send your stories out. So I began to send them to science fiction magazines, and it was those that gave me the best encouragement the soonest. I was still getting rejections for a long time, but I placed a couple with a few small magazines in the field, places that don't exist anymore, and people very likely won't remember unless they're really archivists. But there was a place called Journal Wired that published a couple of my earliest stories, and a place I think it was out of maybe Texas, called Aboriginal Science Fiction. I think that was my official first published piece of fiction. I mean, I'd been placing a few stories with local poetry magazines in Berkeley, and I'd had a zine of my own called Idiot Tooth. So I was creeping towards publication, but the first time I sort of got, a happy reply in my mailbox, I got one of those self-addressed stamped envelopes back with something other than a rejection slip in it. It was from these very small science fiction magazines, and I was ecstatic. I felt like I was launched. So my next efforts mostly focused in that direction, and eventually the key, really the first, important piece of fiction I published in terms of my own sense of accomplishment. And I think it was a real turning point in my sense of my own capacities, was a short story I placed, a long one, a novella with Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. And the story was called The Happy Man. And it was immediately, to my incredible, delight and surprise, it was immediately kind of caught up a little bit in the very lively fan critical culture, and it was nominated for a Nebula Award. And I flew to Atlanta to appear at the Nebula ceremony, and I met all sorts of people all at once who were treating me as a kind of colleague. And so it was a kind of social reinforcement. Suddenly I felt like, okay, I guess I really, I found my people. These guys recognize that I'm doing something, and the power of that validation in the absence of all of the things that in some ways I'd forsaken by leaving college. I was a bookstore clerk. I was working in retail and just dreaming of being a writer. So suddenly I had this field of reference and these colleagues and these magazines that I could send stories to and say, I'm a Nebula nominee. And so it was like instant gratification. I thought, okay, I'm launched. This is what I'm going to do.
I mean, another story of yours that was in Asimov's around that time that's really stuck in my mind was called Vanilla Dunk. Could you talk about how you came up with that story?
Sure, yeah. Actually, it's really germane in a weird way to talking about my new novel, Gambler's Anatomy, in the sense that that's a story about sports and about games, and represents, well, a couple of my early fascinations that are persistent, that have never gone away. I've always been really interested in sports and games as a kind of miniaturized version of life, an arena within the world where people go to enact kind of microcosmic life experiences, and so this interest has prevailed through my childhood fascination with all kinds of board games, with video games once they existed, with gambling, and of course, with fantasy sports once they existed, which they didn't back then. So Vanilla Dunk came out of thinking about basketball as a realm of play that could be turned into something more allegorical or virtual. And of course, I was also thinking about sampling and rap music and race. So it's an early story for me, kind of knocking on the door of my themes of white fantasies about Black cultural style, which points in the direction of my autobiographical novel, Fortress of Solitude. I was thinking about having grown up playing basketball in the schoolyards in Brooklyn, and how much of a racial dynamic was played out in that situation. How much, well, for me, initially, humiliation and well, kind of an education in social hierarchies was played out in my attempts to wander onto those schoolyards and join a half-court pickup game. And then, my brother, to a strong extent, myself to a lesser extent, we were front row witnesses to the birth of hip hop in Brooklyn, and the really fascinating alchemy of street culture that turned into this gigantic, obviously world historical cultural movement. And I thought, well, so what if you could sample skills, physical skills, somatic, talent on the basketball court the way you could sample music in hip hop? What if a white guy essentially could do to black, sports performative style what Vanilla Ice had just done with rap music?
Right. So the players, they have these exosuits that allow them to, say, have those basketball skills of Michael Jordan or somebody like that.
Right. I mean, it's a technology that I've invented where it's meant to be race blind. Great basketball players are just great basketball players. So, in a lottery like they have in sports, new athletes are allowed to pick which Hall of Fame player they're going to be able to perfectly emulate on the court. And it's a white guy who ends up drawing the Michael Jordan skill set.
I mean, were you apprehensive at all as a young writer dealing with those really fraught racial themes?
I should have been. I mean, I'm sure that I was completely, what do you say, above my pay grade in terms of social, racial, historical understanding. What I had were my, adolescent kind of bravado and boldness, and my sense of excitement at identifying themes that seemed big enough to go at. I was just, again, it's so difficult to reproduce how isolated I was at that time. I was working on my own instincts. I was working on research done not online, because there was no online. There were books, and I was reading the books that I happened to find about sports and race and the things I cared about, music criticism. I was writing this story, very ambitious story. I was writing it on the strength of reading Peter Gralnick writing about Elvis Presley. I was writing it on the strength of reading a really wonderful monograph, more than a monograph, big fat survey, academic survey on sports in American fiction by a academic with an unforgettable, lovely name, Christian Messenger. And Christian Messenger had written about baseball fiction, which I was very interested in, and he'd written about football fiction. And then he has this chapter where he says, well, basketball fiction sort of doesn't exist. No one's tried it. It's a barely developed genre, which is one of the things I took as a kind of dare or an invitation. And he proposes, of course, that one of the reasons that it's a future fiction, it's a fiction that people haven't felt comfortable trying to create, was that it was so much an arena for racial dynamics. And I thought, well, I grew up, as an involuntary kind of sponge for racial situations. I was immersed in them by the nature of the life I'd known as a child. And so I thought, I know enough. I know what I feel about this stuff, or I know what questions I want to ask of this material. And I didn't have the sense of being in a world where other people were going to quantify my expertise to be talking about race. I was a fiction writer. I thought it's my job to make stuff up and use the license that comes, with the creative. It's a creative passport. Now it didn't mean I didn't feel that I had to work with a kind of ethical scrupulousness to make it meaningful, not to make it, half-assed or cursory or to reach for easy received pronouncements that were lying to hand on one side or the other of this argument, but to make my own, diligent exploration within the space of the writing. But I didn't think I had to kind of like go and, for better or worse, maybe some people would tell me I should have, that I had to go and kind of do some research in a sociological sense.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of writers, if they start out writing science fiction, they worry that they'll not be taken seriously if they try to write something else. Was that something that you were concerned about, or were you also sort of disconnected from that whole?
Well, I guess I was a kind of a combination of naive and willful at the same time. I was working on enthusiasm and in innocence of a lot of anxieties. I mean, the one that I just rehearsed for you there, I was really innocent of what kinds of anxieties should accompany my creative life. I just thought, I'm going to do this. It matters to me. I'm full of fine intentions, and those will translate. They'll be reflected in the work. My feelings about genre boundaries or the possible stigma that might attach to having published in a genre context, I mean, I wasn't completely unaware of those things, but in a way I decided for myself that they didn't apply to me, that I was going to write with a kind of boundary smashing enthusiasm that would be its own explanation. It would be its own justification. So many of the writers I loved, it seemed to me, with Patricia Highsmith in crime writing or Philip K. Dick in science fiction, or J.G. Ballard, or for that matter, Shirley Jackson, who in some ways had a slightly disreputable aura attached to her of the horror writer, but to me seems so fundamentally literary, such a, remarkable classic short story writer and novelist. I just felt, oh, come on. Everyone gets it now. In a way I declared the revolution to be accomplished, even though it wasn't. And at the same time, I thought, maybe I'll run into some of this pushback when I try to do other kinds of things, but that will be interesting. That will be a battle worth fighting, and I'll be good at it. I'm articulate on these subjects. I felt like I was going to talk the problem to death, much as I'm doing right now. I just thought, if this war isn't won, it's like 80% won. It seemed to me it was by implication. The writing was on the wall. I felt Don DeLillo, wrote virtual science fiction, and Donald Barthelme wrote absurdist, fantastical stories that were in the New Yorker that were strongly akin to, Italo Calvino, and also to, R.A. Lafferty or Robert Sheckley. And to me, it just seemed like transparent that these arguments were, if they still existed, they existed because of calcified bias, old hierarchical and kind of class anxious systems of putting quarantines around popular culture that rock and roll and film noir and R. Crumb and the great science fiction writers and Raymond Chandler had all made absurd. That the existence of so much vitality in popular and vernacular genres and modes made that argument absurd to anyone who actually cared about culture, who cared about being excited and enlightened by their encounter with culture. So I thought, no one worth arguing with even still holds this view. Well, I was quite innocent in some ways. I mean, the kerfuffle around Bob Dylan's Nobel just this last couple of days gives you all the evidence you need that ancient hidebound hierarchies and anxieties about keeping a quarantine between high and low, those things are powerfully alive So I was wrong in a way. But I'm still devoted in a way to the part of myself that went forward at that moment with this marvelous innocence and optimism about the eradication of these fundamentally pointless high-low, quarantines, the sort of stigma attached to certain arenas of cultural activity like rock and roll or comic books or pulp genres like the hard-boiled detective story or science fiction, because I think the fundamental associations of those things with the center of American cultural life has been demonstrated over and over and over again. And maybe by embodying that positivity when I began, I did help change a few minds at least.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned comic books, and another story of yours I really wanted to ask you about is called Super Goatman. That's always really stuck with me. Could you just talk about what you were going for with that story?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I based that story, first of all, on a dream. It's one of a handful of stories I can point to that originate with a really vivid dream image that seemed to, be trying to pronounce something to me, and I had to begin writing to figure out what it was trying to say. And in a way, I think of Super Goatman as an emblem of my divided, you might almost say my tortured feelings about my parents' generation, the kind of the bohemian boomers, right? The 60s radicals and artists who dared to ask so much who dared to transform themselves and try to transform the world so fearlessly in the late 50s and through the 60s and right into the very beginning of the 70s when I was coming to consciousness. And of course, the main character in Super Goatman is of that generation, and the narrator who's watching him and thinking about him and quite ambivalent about him is my age, someone who came of age right as the sort of idealism of the 60s generation was meeting so much pushback and resistance and was curdling and revealing its contradictions at the beginning of and through the middle of the 1970s. So it's a story about how beautiful and absurd and painful and exciting it was to have parents who, went all in on the 60s, essentially. I think of Super Goatman really as a kind of disguised vision of Allen Ginsberg. He's like this character like Ginsberg who his bravery is super heroic, and he's totally attractive and totally ridiculous at the same time. And he is capable, on the one hand, of changing everything, transforming the culture. And at the same time, paradoxically, and in a very strange and painful way, he's capable of being put back in the box. By the time of Reaganism, a figure like Ginsberg seems like a relic and easily mocked. And so Super Goatman is meant to somehow be an emblem of all of that difficult stuff. When I was reading comic books in the 70s, it was the tail end of the Marvel Silver Age. And I was reading the older comic books because that was one of the things you did was read, old tattered 1960s Kirby, comic books, the Fantastic Four, the classic stuff that someone's older brother had in a long box. But the books that were on the newsstands that were sort of mine, that were my era, were written by hippies like Steve Gerber or Jim Starlin, or any number of those guys who were sometimes literally like tripping while they conceived these stories. And they were reflecting this anxiety at the curdling of the idealism of the 60s, I think, in many ways. And the superheroes were failing. They were anti-heroic, or they were, tormented dissidents against a kind of universe that was persecuting them. Someone like Warlock or Omega the Unknown, or the characters, in Steve Gerber's Defenders, Nighthawk. They reflected, or the turn that Captain America takes at that moment into being this character who renounces, around the time of Watergate, renounces his affiliation and becomes someone called the Nomad instead. This was the kind of superhero I identified with, this sort of end of the line, anti-heroic, soul-searching, miserable superhero of the early and mid 70s. And so Super Goatman isn't that different from one of those guys.
I mean, do you think he'll write any more about superheroes, or has it gotten so big now that it's sort of lost some of its appeal?
I don't think I have much left to say. I think if I look back, I'm almost surprised at how much energy I was able to pour into that vehicle. As a reader, and I mean this in the broadest sense, a comic book reader and a reader per se, I'd pretty much exhausted my interest in the image of the superhero, that iconography, by the time I was 17 years old. And I was turning more to reading R. Crumb comics and books, genre fiction and literary fiction. In college, Watchmen was published. And, in the years that I was in college and then dropped out of college, and that turned my head. I read that, but what is that except a total endgame? It's an autopsy. It's saying these figures are unbearably contradictory and they're not sustainable. So I was very, that was kind of my last flirtation with the superhero, in terms of my own appetite as a reader for new stories. Now I'd sometimes go back and page through my old tattered copies of Omega or Ragman or one of these other kind of distaff characters that I was weirdly into. But I agreed with Alan Moore's autopsy in Watchmen. I didn't think there was anything left. And so the fact that they've taken over the culture at large, and in some ways I'm almost a party to that by, writing about them in a way in The Fortress of Solitude, is peculiar to me. I can't really celebrate it. It doesn't seem that interesting to me as a film goer with a tremendous commitment to the, classical genre image of Hollywood history. The fact that the Western is a sort of incredible vehicle for talking about things that are much, much larger than just the actual West. It conveys a lot of information and arguments, and also, needless to say, a lot of insane falsehoods about the factual story of the American West. But it's also a kind of allegorical space where pure morality tales and existential stories can be worked out. I have a deep investment in Westerns as a genre. I have a deep investment in film noir. The screwball comedy means a lot to me. As far as like film genres go, I think one of the least satisfying film genres I've ever encountered is the contemporary superhero movie, which just seems to me kind of dead on arrival. I don't find those movies to be, they don't speak to me. I can't even get into the hair splitting about, but there's 3 or 4 good ones. I just don't see any life there. In fact, I don't see them as deeply innately related to the comic books, or graphic novels as a medium. It seems to me, for reasons I could go on about if you really want me to. I don't know if you want me to. It seems to me there's a disconnect at a fundamental formal level between what a comic book does when you encounter it and what a CGI superhero movie does when you encounter it, that mean that I just don't find that action is, translatable. And so, no, this is a long-winded way of saying I doubt it. I doubt it. I mean, I wrote about the failure of powers. That's what I write about in Fortress of Solitude. Having the magic ring is utterly useless. You can't save anyone on those terms, right? In a way, I'm rehearsing that same sense of exhaustion about vicarious powers again in Gambler's Anatomy, with the uselessness of the telepathic power in that book.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about Gambler's Anatomy. You mentioned that there's this fairly useless telepathic power. Could you talk about why you decided to put telepathy into the book?
I'll try. It's in some ways it's like the mysterious secret sauce in that book. Even to me, as the writer of it, I didn't sort of invite it into the space. I had a plan. My plan was to write a book about a backgammon hustler, and my plan was to write about an expatriate character, and my plan was to write about this devastating facial surgery. I mean, what's funny for me in a way is I did have a genre thought going in. I thought, I want this to be like a David Cronenberg movie. I want it to be, I mean, I don't really mean like an early one. It was nowhere near as desublimated in its sexuality or its bloodiness or its craziness as the early Cronenberg. But I wanted to write something like a kind of quiet novel of menace with a lot of body horror just lurking under the surface. So something maybe more like late David Cronenberg. And in that sense, I was going into this book thinking, hey, maybe this is my belated first attempt to write a horror novel. Now, especially in a context like or a venue like your podcast, I should put a provision on that, which is that it's only opening myself up to the mockery of the true horror aficionados to speak of this book in those terms, because anyone who cares for that tradition is going to say, A, it's not scary enough, and B, it's not transgressive or creepy or gory enough. It just doesn't qualify. And I would agree. I wouldn't have encouraged my publisher to put the word horror onto the dust jacket. But in my mind, it was usefully thought of in those terms, that I really wanted to write about a character's descent into a kind of hell. And I also wanted the surgical chapters to be, to a certain degree, kind of like read them through, through your hands. Like, I don't want to look at the page, but I got to look at the page. Have those chapters involve a kind of specificity about the body horror and a duration, have them go on and on and on, so that the reader might be tempted to say, get me out of here. And I was very interested in the sense in which the book seemed to me like it echoed certain kinds of stories or movies of menace and horror. And I was thinking of Eyes Without a Face, the great French medical horror film from the 1950s, and I was thinking of the great Paranoid film by David Frankenheimer with Rock Hudson called crap. Why am I blocking the title of this? It's in it a kind of average middle-aged businessman, aging, living in the suburbs, applies for, it's called Seconds. And in Seconds, this guy applies for a special secret operation where you can have yourself made youthful and glamorous again. And they basically take his face off and put Rock Hudson's face on instead. And then the rest of the film, he's played by Rock Hudson. And needless to say, it doesn't work out, and it doesn't work out in the most dramatic and it's like a super developed and exquisitely photographed and written Twilight Zone episode. And so that was sort of the mode I wanted to be in, was paranoid, Rod Serling, horror, identity horror. What happens if your face is taken off? And I in none of these plans to write about the gambling or to write about the surgery or to write about Berlin and Singapore, as I was excited to do, did my character necessarily need to be telepathic. And in a weird way, I think I inched into that territory despite myself. I was looking for a form of interiority that this extremely superficial and strangely flat character could have. And I wanted to talk about his desire not to know other people, and the idea of a refused telepathic power, a declined telepathic power, suddenly seemed to me a really beautiful kind of allegorical way to describe someone who's saying basically no thank you to other human beings. He'd rather stay in the bubble of his own solipsistic narcissism. He doesn't want to know how other people feel. And no sooner had I committed to it as a kind of metaphorical or allegorical gesture than I realized I liked it too much to leave it on the table as a kind of a figurative language. I wanted it. I liked it. And so there I was, writing my first chapter, having planned the book. Actually, it was one of the books I've come nearest to really planning completely before I write it. I mostly improvise. I on the spectrum of, improvisation versus planning, I tend to be strongly on the side of improvisation. But this book, I had to kind of a map going in, and this had not appeared on the map, but it emerged in the first chapter when I began actually writing about the character, and I loved it, and I committed to it, even though I didn't know what I was driving at. In a sense, I didn't know what place it had in this plan, and it stayed alive in the book. It's sustained, and I mean, it's, in some ways it's kind of a thread or a whisper. I think it's even eligible to be read as a metaphor, and this speaks to my attachment to that mode, which I associate in some ways with, Kafka's fiction, or with the Twilight Zone with Rod Serling, or, it goes back to something like Ambrose Bierce and Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. And that's the mode where there's a disturbance, there's a ripple in the reality of the story, but you don't know for certain. You can't always be clear as to whether that disturbance, that weirdness, that uncanniness is properly located on the inside of the character's head or the outside of the character's head.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned the book is really uncanny and you don't know what's true and what's not. I really felt reading the book like I was going insane. And I was just wondering, did you, is that what you're going for? Do you feel like you have to go a little bit insane to write a book like this, or? Well,
I certainly wanted to impose a kind of sense of dissolving self on the reader. I mean, much as, I want you to feel like you have Tourette syndrome for the extent of the time you're reading Motherless Brooklyn. I think if that book works, it's because it forces you to experience it as a kind of mirror, as, potentially that it's telling you about how your own brain is working, and that you have to sort of accept the diagnosis, at least until you close the book, and then you can immediately be relieved and say, wait a minute, that was him, not me. And I think that I wanted to write a book about not just the disintegration of self, but in a way about how flimsy the contraption of self is to begin with. The whole point about Bruno, my character in Gambler's Anatomy, is that when you begin to see how he's arranged himself as a personality moving through the world, that it's really kind of a claptrap construction to begin with. It's very, very provisional. It relies enormously on other people's, on received impressions, sort of like, well, people see me this way. Okay, that's good enough. That'll be who I am. And so the moment that this flimsy contraption is put under pressure, and of course I put it under enormous pressure by the middle of the book, it starts to seem like it was never viable. Like, how could you reach middle age and have so little to speak of in the way of a personality? Well, this, I'm not accusing my reader or confessing myself to being a tissue-thin persona, but I do feel interested in, and I want to explore the ways in which what seems so rock solid to us, identity, me, who I am. Come on, I'm right here. I feel myself every day. I wake up and there I am again. How it might be, in fact, reliant in some surprising ways upon, kind of very, kind of provisional structures that were, kind of like when you go through Los Angeles and you see all these buildings that were thrown up in 10 minutes, like a hot dog stand that was thrown up in 10 minutes 100 years ago, and it's still standing. And it's like, well, there was never an earthquake. There was never a hurricane. It doesn't snow here. And it's still standing. I guess that's, a building that a lot of who we are may be kind of make do, makeshift, received notions, scraps, impressions that we sort of stuck to. And they worked well enough. We moved forward. And then one day we turned around and nothing better had ever come along. So that turns out to have been who you are.
I mean, one line, as a science fiction fan, one line that really jumped out at me is the brain surgeon character thinks at one point that heart surgeons are like Scotty on the Enterprise down in the engine room, whereas the brain surgeons are like the Vulcans. And I was just wondering, is that an analogy that you came up with, or did some doctor actually say that to you?
I think that popped into my head unbidden. I certainly, I had my my short, intense phase as there was a point at which Star Trek, and I mean by this, Nimoy, Shatner, Star Trek, seemed like it had a fund of metaphors for anything. I just looked at it as kind of like it was like a language to me. When I was 16, 17, 18 years old, there's something about the archetypal quality of those first episodes, the first 3 years, that I used to play a game. I think I even inserted this into the Fortress of Solitude. A couple of the teenagers are playing a game where they're talking about the Beatles and the Wizard of Oz and Star Trek as the kind of pivotal or emblematic instances of, character type that you could basically break any group of friends or any human nuclear family or any important configuration of personalities in the arts down into, who was John, who was Paul, who was Ringo, who was George. Or you could with equal credibility, you could say, who's Scotty, who's Spock, who's Kirk, and who's Bones. And so it wasn't very, it wasn't a very esoteric leap for me to have this sort of nerdy head up his ass surgeon default to the same kind of comparison.
Yeah. Okay, so the latter section of the book takes place in Berkeley, and there are these kind of there's an anarchist character, and he's constantly referencing all these anarchist/communist writers, Kropotkin, Emma Goldman, Mikhail Bakunin, Bookchin, Novatore. I'm not really familiar with them terribly. Would you say, are these writers that you think sort of their ideas didn't pan out, or do you think that they're people who readers should investigate more?
Oh, I think that would be a fantastic result. I know that the anarchism in the book is kind of sealed in a absurdist, holding area, because you encounter it only in the space of this hamburger stand, right? It's been totally engulfed within the great symbol of American capitalism, which is the fast food restaurant. So how can anarchism possibly be a living presence if it's been sealed up inside this cardboard container full of sliders? But for what it's worth, those figures are immensely what should I say, arousing to me. I actually am. I'm weird about anarchism, capital A anarchism, in that I grew up inside punk subculture to an extent. When I was a kid, I was very drawn to it. It seemed like a safe home for certain kinds of sensations or feelings. My alienation is the simplest word for it. My alienation found a home as a teenage punk. But the capital A anarchists were like the bridge too far. The guys who were spray painting that A with a circle around it always seemed to me like the violent punks who I wanted nothing to do with. So I was given this weird anxiety about the history of political anarchism, even as I very, very slowly became someone who was actively cultivating some kind of comprehension of the history of the American left, which, needless to say, that interest culminates in to an enormous and almost impossible extent in a long novel I wrote about it just a few years ago called Dissident Gardens. But anarchism is, for me, it's still like the coming understanding. I'm still it's like I'm taking it out of some weird deep freeze in my own brain, and I can't account for myself in the simple sense of having inserted those writers and those quotations, because I do use real quotations from real anarchists in Garrett's conversation in the book, The Hamburger Flipper. It's not like I had a program that I was sort of like, and here's where I'll get people to think about this. It's more like, even as I was inching towards a more genuine and open engagement with a long-delayed open engagement with the actual history of actual anarchist thinking in my own life, in a very scattershot flirtation, but it's sort of underway. I was developing my feeling for this character and what he would care about, and daring myself to take him seriously at certain levels, even as I knew he was a figure of absurd compromise, and his powers are qualified or compromised in all sorts of ways in the book. I mean, he's a kind of super Goatman, if you want to think of him on those terms, lurking in the book. And in that way, he also relates to another very paradoxical character from a book called Chronic City. He's a miniature version of a character I wrote called Perkus Tooth, who's there to provoke not just the reader, but to provoke the writer into, thinking harder about dismissed, he's insisting on historical knowledge. He's saying, you're floating in a bubble of convenience and amnesia, and I'm going to be like the Jiminy Cricket here. I'm going to say, you took your eye off the ball, and you did it a long time ago, but it's not too late to take this stuff seriously.
Okay, so one last thing I really wanted to ask you about while I have you is that you were very involved as an editor in getting the work of Philip K. Dick out to a wider audience, both the Exegesis and the Library of America. And I was just wondering if you could talk about just sort of personally, what does that mean to you to have brought his work to a wider audience?
It means the world to me. He was such a, when I talk about punk identity, when I was 14, 15, 16, being a safe haven for my alienation, for the difficulty of being human that I experienced in those years. The other and equally crucial safe haven for me in that exact same time frame, was discovering Philip K. Dick. He, in the simplest sense, his writing made me feel that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't crazy and that I wasn't alone, and that my worldview, my apprehensions about how the world was structured could be described, they could be modeled, they could be made fun of. It's like it's more than saying he expanded my brain or expanded my worldview. He made my own dawning worldview safe, in a sense. He took care of it. So there's very few writers or very few cultural figures, just the smallest possible number, who go in the category of kind of saving your life. For me, David Byrne and Bob Dylan, which is not to say that this, you're not going to be critical of their failings, but the intervention is at that level. And Philip K. Dick is the writer who, and Kafka, who helped me accept who I was and how I felt. So the fact that, so it circles back to the very beginning of the conversation, right? Then having felt that way, that I could identify that he was in a weird way he was in disrepute, or he was in no repute. He was he'd fallen out of the cultural argument. He wasn't even consistently cherished within the holding area that was genre science fiction. He was sort of viewed with an arched eyebrow within the history of the genre by many people at that point as a kind of a, awkward figure or an embarrassing figure. And so I participated in this really, grassroots level. I got involved with Paul Williams, the great rock critic who created Crawdaddy magazine, but also devoted himself in the middle of his life story to creating. Well, he interviewed Phil Dick for Rolling Stone magazine, which in some ways was the largest chunk of legitimation from the culture at large that Dick received during his life. And, from that moment on, every paperback edition of his books quoted Rolling Stone on the jacket, usually on the front of the jacket, right? So it was a really important gesture. And then, having done that, Paul was made into Phil's literary executor. And what he did, because he was a zine guy, he'd helped create pop and music writing, rock writing, by starting a zine called Crawdaddy, and he was involved in science fiction zines with David Hartwell. Well, so what he did was he started a zine essentially called the Philip K. Dick Newsletter, Philip K. Dick Society Newsletter, and I helped Paul do this. And so, the end point is that these books end up in the Library of America in these gorgeous hardcover editions that nestle alongside, Faulkner and Hemingway and Flannery O'Connor and the speeches of Lincoln and, so many other astounding artifacts from the Americanist canon, right? Which is where Dick ended up and where he belongs. I have no reservations. But that's only the culmination of something. As a kid, essentially, when I was 19 and I dropped out of college and ran away to Berkeley, what I was going there to do was to involve myself in the Philip K. Dick Society and help Paul to, fold and stamp these newsletters and send them out to people who cared. I think at its peak, the subscription rolls were only in the three figures, in the high three figures. It was like 800 people were receiving this newsletter. That is to say that this is an example of a tiny, tiny contingent of passionate true believers changing the universe, because that is the things Paul was doing and the things that the recipients of those newsletters were doing by continuing to read Dick's writing when it was totally out of print in America. And I mean, it was 100% out of print in America. The only book you could buy in a new bookstore was a movie tie-in edition of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep that had Harrison Ford on the cover. and was retitled. That group of readers and critics and true believers changed literary history. Philip K. Dick is taught in not just a handful of universities that happen to have, maybe a kind of a homely little science fiction class. He's taught in critical theory and American studies, and he's taught in American literature contexts, and he's read everywhere. And the story I'm telling is one that people almost can't believe is true anymore. And it's, it's part of my living memory and the living memory of a bunch of other readers my age and older who saw him, there's almost no comparison for his retrieval from ignominy or from the margins of American literature, unless you look to stories like Melville, or the way Henry James suffered a period of being out of print, so it's to be part of that experience, because it's really, as much as it's an accomplishment for me, it was an experience that I was a part of. I can't say enough what it means to me.
Yeah, no, Philip K. Dick is one of my favorite authors, so to see all that happen was just really, really exciting for me. So thank you so much for the role that you played in that.
You bet.
And unfortunately, we're all out of time. So, Jonathan, do you have any just other projects you want to mention, or final thoughts or anything?
Oh, I'm all out of projects. I just finished this book, and I'm dreaming now. I'm back to dreaming of what might come next. Thanks so much for the good conversation.
Oh yeah, no, thank you so much for joining us. And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Jonathan Lethem for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Stefano Dombrosi in the UK, who writes, "Brilliant. Topics, content, guests, and presenter are really excellent. Actual fans talking to fans. Love the passion in the conversations and the depth in which you go. Would like an episode on classic sci-fi books, best ones to read, and possibly the evolution of sci-fi literature I think would be great. Keep it up." So big thanks again to Stefano Dombrosi for that great review. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. I'd also like to thank Unbound Worlds for sponsoring today's show. Remember to enter their free book giveaway over at unboundworlds.com/sweeps. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.